Toronto Police Service Race and Identity-Based Data Collection Strategy, Analysis to Action Model, Roadmap to Equity. This section addresses reported uses of force, a key area of focus mandated under the Anti-Racism Act. This video will take us through data considerations, context of use of force in police interactions, and key findings. We took administrative data, information and records designed to support policing operations and accountabilities, and turned them into data sets that can be analyzed. This brings along significant challenges, but also important opportunities to identify broad trends and patterns. We note some key considerations around the data. There are critical limitations with the provincial use of force report form, which we attempted to address by bringing in data from other sources in our internal systems. The level of analysis are incidents of reported use of force. If an incident involves people perceived as a different race from each other, it is categorized as multiple race group. The small number of use of force incidents limits how finely we can cut the data. Connecting use of force with occurrence data expands our capability to explore deeper questions. We were able to connect 889 use of force incidents to general occurrence data. Unconnected reports were due to data entry errors or locked occurrences, such as serious ongoing criminal investigations. To understand the nature of incidents before and after officers arrive on the scene, we gathered dispatcher information, calls for service, as well as information recorded by officers. Calls for service and primary offense or incident types are categorized in groups to identify meaningful trends. This includes where incidents occur across the city that are associated with the use of force and where arrests took place that resulted in a strip search. Any use of force is a concern to members of the public and has impacts on officers. To put it into the larger context of all police interactions with the public, there were about 700,000 interactions in response to 911 calls, traffic and pedestrian stops, and other policing activities, such as officer-initiated events, premise checks, or crowd control at events. This does not include parking enforcement calls or phone reports. Of those, 86,000 interactions resulted in an enforcement action. Enforcement actions are incidents that resulted in arrests, apprehensions, diversions, serious provincial offense tickets, and includes those classified as suspects or subjects in an occurrence record. Of those 86,000 enforcement actions, there were 949 reportable use of force incidents. That is, incidents that involved an individual member of the public where officers used physical force that required medical attention, used firearms or taser, or a service animal. It doesn't include when officers unintentionally fired a handgun during training in a police facility, animal dispatches, or team reports. The 949 reportable use of force incidents made up 0.2% of all of our interactions with the public. Within those use of force incidents, there were 371 incidents in which firearms were pointed or discharged. In 4 incidents, firearms were discharged, and in 2 incidents, those injuries were fatal. Although the number of reported uses of force was small in comparison to our overall interactions, we recognize that each one is unique and has impacts on the individual, their families, the communities, and officers involved. We often heard concerns about use of force and proactive policing, or the kinds of 911 calls that officers respond to and may lead to a use of force. It's important to understand the nature of the call for service when officers are dispatched to an incident or initiates an interaction that may be associated with a reported use of force. The majority of reported use of force incidents started out as a 911 call. The largest category by far, making up almost half of the reported use of force incidents in 2020, are violent calls for service. Violent calls for service include assaults in progress, assault just occurred, homicide, person with a gun, person with a knife call, sexual assault, stabbing, unknown trouble, assault, and fights. The second most largest category are calls for service in progress or just occurred events, such as break-and-enters, assaults, etc. Calls in progress, just occurred, or violent calls for service are often the highest priority calls for service that police respond to. Proactive events, such as vehicle and subject stops and premise checks, made up less than 8% or 68 reportable use of force incidents. Contrary to popular assumptions, officer-initiated interactions are less likely to be associated with the use of force. They made up 10% of enforcement actions, but less than 8% of use of force incidents. Other priority 4 calls for service accounted for less than 8% of all reported use of force incidents. Some examples are when officers are asked to check addresses or well-being, unwanted guests, disorderlies, disputes, etc. Persons in crisis calls for service made up less than 7% of reportable use of force incidents. Persons in crisis calls are also less likely to be associated with reported use of force, as they made up 13% of all enforcement actions and less than 7% of use of force incidents. We also looked at time trends to see if there are patterns over the course of the day in reported use of force, and compared it to interactions due to police enforcement activities at different times of day. We calculated when enforcement action and use of force incidents were below or above the daily average for each hour of the day. This graph shows how there are differences in trends by time of day, with use of force incidents increasing throughout the day and peaking around 9 p.m., whereas enforcement actions peaked at 11 a.m., plateaued during the day, and declined throughout the night. As we saw earlier, violent calls for service made up the largest category of incidents involving uses of force. In particular, we heard how violent calls for service that involved weapons was of highest concern for public and officer safety. We looked at time trends for these types of incidents to see if they would be more in line with use of force trends than enforcement actions more generally. We isolated enforcement actions related to violent calls for service involving weapons. These include person with a gun, person with a knife, shooting, sound of shotgun, stabbing, or wounding. In 2020, there were less than 2,000 enforcement actions that started as a violent call for service involving weapons. We broke it up into 5 periods and compared enforcement action incidents that were associated with the use of force and those that did not. For those which there was a reported use of force incident, they were more likely to have taken place in the evening and nighttime periods between 4 p.m. and midnight. While calls for service help us to understand the description provided by dispatchers prior to the officer arriving on scene, once an officer gets there, the nature of the incident may turn out to be quite different. For example, an event may be described to the dispatcher as a suspicious event, but once an officer gets there, it may turn out to be a mental health incident. Hence, it is helpful to examine reported use of force incidents by the primary offense or nature of incident as described by the officer. We were able to link 94% of use of force incidents with the associated occurrence information from our records management system. For this analysis, we grouped primary offenses into categories. The totals add up to more than 889 because a use of force incident may involve more than one type of offense. The largest category of primary offense involved in a use of force incident were assaults and crimes against persons, followed by those involving weapons and homicide-related offense. Among those occurrence types, enforcement actions involving weapons, homicides, and assaults were more likely to be associated with the reported use of force. For example, weapons and homicide-related offense made up only 2% of enforcement actions, but 24% of reported use of force. Assaults made up 13% of all enforcement actions, but 29% of reported use of force. Mental health-related incidents made up 15% of use of force incidents, followed by failure to appear or comply and parolee incidents at 11%. Enforcement actions involving mental health issues were slightly less likely to involve a use of force. They made up 17% of enforcement actions and about 15% of use of force incidents. Other types of use of force. Incidents involving other offenses made up less than 10% of use of force. What is the relationship between use of force and crime rates in different divisions? As we mentioned earlier, the use of force form does not enable us to identify where the use of force incident took place, so we had to look at the location where the original occurrence, such as break and enter, assault, mental health incident, etc., took place as noted in the occurrence records. This may not be the same as the use of force location. To be able to compare to divisional information, such as local crime rate, we aggregated the location to the divisional level. The use of force rate is the percentage of enforcement action incidents that are associated with the use of force incidents. They range across the city from 0.8% to less than 1.5% of all enforcement actions. Comparing use of force rate against overall crime rates helps us to understand if it influences how officers respond to calls for service in different areas of the city. We can see that there is a weak but positive relationship between use of force and crime rates by division, probably due to the different patterns for the downtown divisions. Incidents in Division 31 and Division 13 had higher use of force rates, but average crime rates, as you can see by the red dots. While incidents in 51 and 52 Division had lower use of force rates, but higher crime rates, as you can see by the green dots. Let's look at the racial breakdown of the City of Toronto and those who had enforcement interactions with police in 2020. We used the projected population counts to understand the makeup of the city in 2020 and account for changes since 2016 when the previous census was taken. The chart shows the proportion of the resident population broken down by race. For example, Black people made up 10% of the city's population, while Middle Eastern people made up 4.4% of the population, etc. We looked at the population of Toronto and compared it to the number of people involved in enforcement actions. This helps us to see if a group is over or underrepresented in police contacts prior to any potential use of force occurring. Among those with police enforcement action in 2020, which includes arrests, serious provincial offense tickets, summons, apprehensions, etc., we see that 23% were perceived as Black, 5.5% Middle Eastern, etc. What this shows us is that Black, Indigenous, and Middle Eastern people were overrepresented in having police interactions relative to their proportion in the city. Other groups were underrepresented in having similar police actions. While a person may experience more than one enforcement action per year, for comparison to the resident population, we counted unique individuals as population counts, one person, one time. We worked with the Community Advisory Panel and engagements with stakeholders and our service members to co-develop questions and hypotheses to explore with our data to understand use of force outcomes and racial disparities. There were 4 key findings that resulted from this work together. Using a multiple benchmarks approach, we found distinct patterns for different race groups, with Black, East, Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern, Latino people overrepresented in use of force incidents when they have contact with police. Let's look at the demographics of those involved in a use of force incident. In 2020, recall that there were 949 reported use of force incidents that involved 1,224 individuals. A use of force incident may involve more than one person and more than one officer. We recognize that each incident has an impact for the individual and officers involved. The 2 largest categories of people involved in use of force incidents were those who were perceived as Black at 39% and those who were perceived as white, 36%. About 9% were perceived as East, Southeast Asian, 6% Middle Eastern, 4% were perceived as Latino, 4% were perceived as South Asian, and 2% were perceived as Indigenous. We looked at the number of people involved in use of force incidents compared to the group's population in enforcement actions. This helps us to see to what extent a group may be over or underrepresented in use of force decisions. For a police use of force to occur, an individual has to have contact with an officer in the first place, whether as a result of a call for service or an officer-initiated interaction. We provide counts of individuals involved in an enforcement action and reported use of force incidents. A person may be involved in more than one incident, so these are not unique individual counts. Looking at this chart, we see that there were differences by race in reported use of force incidents when compared against the enforcement action population. For Black and Latino people, they were overrepresented by about 1.6 times in use of force, while East and Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern people were overrepresented by 1.2 times in use of force incidents compared to their presence in enforcement actions. When in contact with the police, other groups were less likely to be involved in a use of force. Use of force is part of a dynamic of interactions involving police and members of the public, starting with initial contact. There are many decision points along the pathway that may result in a use of force outcome, and racial disparities could be introduced, magnified, or reduced at different points along that pathway. By taking a multiple benchmark approach, we can identify which major decision points contribute to differences in use of force outcomes by race. We found 4 distinct data patterns in the relationship between police contact and use of force. Indigenous people were overrepresented in having contact with police in an enforcement action, but once they have contact with police, they were underrepresented in use of force decisions. What this suggests is that efforts needed to address use of force outcomes involving Indigenous people should focus on prevention, diversion, and referrals. We characterize this data pattern as high contact but low conflict. For Black and Middle Eastern people, they were overrepresented in both police contact and use of force once they have contact, indicating that efforts to reduce disparities in use of force outcomes should focus on what brings police to the scene in the first place, as well as how we are responding to those incidents and making decisions to use force. We characterize this data pattern as high contact, high conflict. Another pattern we found characterized East, Southeast Asian, and Latino people's interactions with police, in which they were underrepresented in coming into police contact, but once they do, there was an overrepresentation in use of force. This pattern is routinely missed when using the resident population as a benchmark. Efforts to address disparities for these groups may focus on use of force decisions and the contexts around police response to incidents involving these groups. Finally, incidents involving white and South Asian people were found to be underrepresented in both police contact and police use of force. This suggests that there may be lessons learned in how we are responding to these incidents involving these groups. Occurrences which happen at different times of day may impact differences found in use of force by race group. We looked at enforcement actions involving different groups at different times of day and compared their proportion against uses of force at those times of day. Overall, Black people were overrepresented in use of force relative to their proportion in enforcement actions, regardless of the time of day that the incident occurred. Incidents involving Indigenous, South Asian, and multiple race groups were more likely to involve a use of force at various different points of time during the day. We also looked at the intersection between race and gender. The majority, or 82%, of incidents associated to use of force incidents involved men, With regard to youth, the majority of use of force incidents, about 96%, did not involve youth. 32 use of force incidents involved a person aged 17 years or younger. Overall, youth were less likely to have a use of force compared to their presence in enforcement actions. Please refer to the detailed report for more information. Our second key finding is that officers may use different types of force in efforts to de-escalate or bring a situation under control, and we found that when force was used, Black people were overrepresented in higher types of force used. All uses of force may have serious impacts on people, and some types of force may have different kinds of impacts and implications. In each use of force incident, there may be more than one officer involved, and each officer may use different kinds of force in attempts to de-escalate or control the situation. We ranked the highest type of force used across all officers in each incident, from lowest, that's physical or other force, through intermediate, which is the less than lethal force, such as the use of a taser, to handgun drawn, and finally firearms pointed or discharged as the highest type of force. There were only 4 incidents in which a firearm was discharged, hence we included it with firearm pointed. We recognize that use of firearms in particular has potential for both psychological harm as well as serious injury or death. Among those who experienced a use of force in 2020, the bar graph shows that use of force incidents with higher types of force had increasing proportions of Black, East Southeast Asian, and multiple race group. In contrast, incidents with higher types of force used had declining proportions of white people involved. Officers may use different types of force in efforts to de-escalate or bring a situation under control. The third key finding was that differences by race remained in incidents after taking into account weapons, calls for service types that result in an enforcement action, and frequency of police enforcement actions. To address whether disparities could be understood by weapons in these incidents, we looked to see if officers' perception of individuals carrying weapons influenced their decision to use different types of force. We compared incidents where weapons were perceived by officers and those where there were no weapons perceived carried by subjects, and looked at the highest type of force used. As expected, officers were more likely to draw a handgun or point firearms where they believed weapons were present and pose a greater danger to public and officer safety. Where no weapons were perceived, lower types of force was more common. When we compared use of force incidents involving Black or white people and where weapons were perceived and not perceived carried, we can see that there are trends in the highest types of force used. When force was used, Black people, indicated by the yellow bar, were more likely to have firearms pointed compared to white people, indicated by the blue bar, regardless of whether weapons were perceived or not. Of particular concern is that the disparity was stronger in situations where no weapons were perceived. What we see here are that Black people were 1.5 times more likely than white people to have firearms pointed as the highest level of force, where weapons were perceived, and 2.3 times more likely to have firearms pointed as the highest level of force, where weapons were not perceived. In contrast, white people were 1.4 times more likely than Black people to have less than lethal force as the highest level of force used where weapons were perceived, and 2.7 times more likely than Black people to have physical or other force used as the highest level of force where no weapons were perceived. In use of force situations where no weapons were perceived, Black people involved were slightly more likely than white people to have less than lethal weapons. The dashed bars on the chart or handgun drawn where no weapons were perceived denote a small number of incidents, and caution should be used in interpreting those numbers. Decisions about use of force may be influenced by the nature of the occurrences which officers were responding to or had initiated contact about. We looked at enforcement actions by the type of calls for service or interaction. For example, violent calls for service. These interactions were also broken down by race to compare the proportion of groups involved in those types of calls for service against their proportion in use of force incidents associated with those interactions. We highlighted numbers in the chart to show where there was an overrepresentation in use of force by race within each call for service type. A call for service type is an emergency or non-emergency call for police service that results in enforcement action. The type indicates a brief description of the call type based on initial information provided to the communications operator. For the purposes of this analysis, we have grouped them into broad categories. Looking at violent calls for service that resulted in an enforcement action, they were more likely to be associated with the use of force when it involved Black and Indigenous people and incidents in which multiple race groups were involved. As you can see by the highlighted cells, similarly, we found that when responding to persons in crisis calls, those involving Black, Indigenous, and multiple race groups were also more likely to be associated with the use of force relative to their presence in those types of calls. Even though proactive events were generally less likely to be associated with the use of force, when they do occur, there were differences by race. Enforcement actions from police-initiated enforcement actions were more likely to be associated with the use of force when they involved multiple race groups, Black, and to a lesser extent, South Asian people. Call for service types may tell us what kind of incident officers may believe they were responding to based on information provided to the dispatcher by members of the public. However, when they arrive on the scene, the nature of the incident may turn out to be different than described. For example, a suspicious event may turn out to be a mental health incident. To better understand the nature of incidents and officer decisions to use force and any racial disparities, we look at primary offense type, which indicates the most serious offense involved or the type of incident as recorded by officers. The highlighted numbers in this chart show where there were racial overrepresentations in use of force incidents relative to their involvement in those types of incidents or primary offenses. Looking at the two biggest categories that characterized use of force incidents, when dealing with incidents of assault and crimes against person, those involving Indigenous, Black, Latino, and South Asian people were more likely to be associated with the use of force incident. In contrast, when it comes to dealing with weapons and homicide-related offenses, a use of force was most likely to occur when officers responded to those incidents. And when they occurred, there was no or very little racial disparities in police use of force. Incidents where there were notable differences by race varied, as you can see by the highlighted cells. That is, where some racial groups were overrepresented in use of force by 2 times or higher than their proportion in those incidents, robberies involving Black people, drug-related offenses involving South Asian people, and mischief or fraud involving Indigenous people. Those who have more frequent interactions with police may also have a higher chance that one of those interactions may involve a use of force. We looked at frequency of enforcement actions to see if there were differences by race and if that influenced disparities. We grouped incidents by the number of times a person involved had interacted with police in an enforcement action in 2020. For incidents involving those who had only one enforcement action, Black people were the only group overrepresented in reported use of force. Among those with a recent history of 5 or more enforcement actions, Black and Latino people were overrepresented in use of force. We found that Black people were overrepresented in use of force regardless of the number of times they had an enforcement action. On the other hand, Indigenous and South Asian people and multiple race groups had between 2 to 5 police interactions were overrepresented in use of force. We considered whether the nature of repeated interactions mattered in order to understand what we could do to address this. One of the highest safety concerns in the city are weapons and homicide-related offenses. Are those with more frequent weapons offenses more likely to experience a use of force? we found that regardless of the frequency of weapons offenses, incidents involving multiple race groups were more likely to be associated with the use of force. Among those with multiple recent enforcement actions related to weapons offenses, those involving Black people, Middle Eastern people, and multiple race groups were also overrepresented in use of force relative to their presence in those incidents. In contrast, white people were less likely to be associated with the reported use of force regardless of the frequency of weapons offenses they were involved in. The fourth key finding is we also found differences across locations by division in use of force rates, taking into account the demographics of the resident population. To help us understand and drive concrete actions in collaboration with partners across the city, we looked at use of force rates by location of the incidents. The location refers to where the original occurrence, such as the break and enter, assault, etc., took place and which resulted in an enforcement action. This is not the use of force location. The use of force report form does not enable us to identify where the use of force itself took place. We aggregated the location to the divisional level as this is a police administrative boundary. Due to the small numbers when breaking down the 949 use of force incidents across 17 divisions, we focused the findings on incidents involving Black and white people, the two largest groups involved in use of force. The maps show the use of force rates against enforcement actions with darker colors indicating higher rates. As you can see by the overall differences in tone between the two maps, there were lower rates of reported use of force for white people compared to those involving Black people. Enforcement actions that occurred in central Toronto and West Scarborough had higher use of force rates involving Black people compared to the rest of the city. Incidents occurring in the northwest area of Toronto were more likely to be associated with the use of force involving white people relative to the rest of the city. Through our engagements with the Community Advisory Panel and our members, we heard that we need to take local population demographics into account to understand local trends. We broke down the proportion of each race group in the resident population and use of force rate aggregated to divisional boundaries, and identified the degree of over or under representation of each group in the local population on the horizontal axis and in the use of force on the vertical axis. Each color of dots in the chart here depicts a race group by location, that is, aggregated to the TPS division. This allows us to look at the disproportionality between the presence of that race group in the resident population and compare it to the disproportionality in use of force rate involving that group. Values above 1 on each axis indicate an overrepresentation of that group within that division. The patterns we found do not show a clear relationship between use of force and local demographics that explains racial disparities. Looking at the shaded area, there were higher overrepresentations of Black, East, Southeast Asian, Indigenous, and South Asian people in use of force rates in divisions where those groups were underrepresented in the local population.